Hello and welcome to this week's edition of 50 Years Serving the Island, where each week we bring you highlights from Manx Radio's first 5 decades serving the public in the Isle of Man. In 1968, Manx Radio was transferred into public ownership to become the island's public service broadcaster. This week we bring you an edition of Time to Remember, presented by David Callister, which was first broadcast as part of a special series in 2005. Marking the 175th anniversary of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company.
The sound of your life, Manx Radio.
Hello, this is David Callister with another Time to Remember in our series marking the 175th anniversary of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company. And today we hear something of the history of the company, some of which comes from the pages of Island Lifeline by Connery Chappell, and some from reminiscences of people who were involved. The Steam Packet Company was formed 15 years after the Battle of Waterloo, with capital totalling £7,250, and the first vessel, a paddle steamer named Mona's Isle, was built in Glasgow. 25 years ago, in 1980, during the week of the 150th anniversary, the director and general manager, Sidney Shimon, recorded a programme for Manx Radio in which he looked back at the company's history. The first official sailing is recorded as taking place on the 16th of August 1830, but Sid Shimon pointed out that it really took place 2 days earlier.
This is when the ship left the shipbuilding yard in the Clyde and came to Douglas. The next day it took the directors and stockholders on an excursion to the Menai Straits in North Wales, and then the following morning it did the first sail to Liverpool. 32 passengers were on board, the speed of the vessel 8.5 knots, so the time on passage would be about 9 hours.
Yes, that's a pretty good time, really, isn't it?
It was.
Yeah. Now, the Mona's Isle Company, which was later to become the Steam Packet, had, I gather, a major rival in those days, the St. George Company. Apparently they'd race the boats to and fro to outdo each other on the sort of minutes saved on the journeys.
Yes, this is true. It seemed a bit ridiculous when you look at it now that we're talking in terms of saving 2 minutes on passage, etc., but it was intense rivalry. But the story that I rather like concerns probably the most famous captain that the Steam Packet ever employed, Captain Gill, who obviously was an extremely astute seaman. And one evening, sensing that there would be a southwest gale the next day, he worked his crew all night and shifted all the coal to the bunkers on the windward side of the vessel, so that the vessel had a list to port. When he sailed the next day, there was a southwest gale, and the effect of the wind was to put the vessel on an even keel, so he got maximum of efficiency from both paddle boxes and actually made the journey 3 hours quicker than his rival.
He was something of well, he was quite a captain, that fellow.
He really was.
I suppose it's not fair to say, but you wouldn't get fellas like doing that sort of thing today, would you?
Wouldn't get the men to do it.
No. This vessel, the St. George, the competitor of yours, came to a rather sticky end, didn't she?
Yes. Actually, they both vessels came to Douglas, and an easterly gale was imminent, so Captain Gill took the Mona's Isle out well off into the sea and anchored her for the night. But for some reason, the captain of the St. George, a Lieutenant Tudor RN, decided to anchor in Douglas Bay. Well, the inevitable happened. He snapped his anchor cable. The ship was pounded onto Callister rocks and broken up. And it's interesting here that William Hilary, who at that time lived in what afterwards became the Fort Anne Hotel and has recently been demolished, witnessed all this happening, got some volunteers together, and despite the atrocious weather, rowed out to Callister Rock and rescued all the crew. Within 2 years, he built on Callister Rock what is now known as the Tower of Refuge, and the name, of course, is self-explicit. But then he went on further and became the founder of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution.
Through the early years, there were numerous competitors for the Steam Packet Company to contend with.
There were masses of them in and out. The Isle of Man and Liverpool Steam Packet in 1836 and 37, and they then went into liquidation. And then in 1853, a group of Ramsey businessmen decided to form the Ramsey Steamship Company. Castletown was the capital at that time, and in 1854, some businessmen in Castletown said, well, why should Ramsey and Douglas have a shipping service and not us? So they formed one. Both these companies eventually amalgamated to try and fight the main rival, the Steam Packet Company, but both in fact lost a lot of money, and within a couple of years they sold their boats to Cunard. They went down into the Mediterranean and they disappeared from the scene.
Connery Chappell's book, Island Lifeline, which is a very, very interesting volume, tells us that even back as far as 1887, I thought this was interesting, there was a company known as Manx Line.
Yes, this is quite true. It was really an outcome of the shipyard Fairfields, who built two fine vessels on spec, hoping to sell them to the steam packet, known as or called the Prince of Wales and the Queen Victoria. But the steam packet apparently were not in the market for more ships at that time. So a group of English businessmen bought the ships and set them up in opposition to the company. There was fierce rivalry, fares were slashed down to ridiculous levels, and in the 2 ensuing years, the steam packet just failed to break even, but Manx Line lost an awful lot of money, and as a consequence, they went into liquidation, and the Steam Packet Company acquired the two vessels.
Yeah. Of course, all the early ships, boats were paddle steamers, weren't they? How would the travel on those compared with that of today? Have you got any record, for instance, of accommodation and the facilities that were available?
Well, in the early days, the travel conditions were rough, of course, but because there were no lounges or deck housings. You were either in the open on deck or you were batting below decks if the weather was bad.
Yeah.
There were no stabilizers, of course, but just an interesting thing that came to my notice this week, I was reading an article about this company I mentioned to you, the Ramsey Steamship Company. The name of their vessel, incidentally, was Manx Ferry. It was describing the accommodation, and in the lower lounge there were two colossal stained glass windows, one depicting Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, and the other Shakespeare's Tempest. I don't see the Tempest as very appropriate.
No,
and the portholes were all emblazoned with a floral design.
When Sid Shimon joined the Steam Packet Company in the late 30s, they had 16 vessels. These included the one which he told me was his all-time favourite, the Mona's Queen, which was lost at Dunkirk.
What do you think the most important engineering developments have been in your time with the company? Because there have been a lot of changes in shipping, haven't there?
Yes, well, I must confess that my tendency is towards steam rather than diesel. The steam turbine, of course, was invented long before I joined the company, but probably this is why I think it's one of the most important engineering developments. In the late 1940s, Parsons and Metrovix and the other turbine builders all got together, and eventually in the early 1950s they brought out a new style of turbine called the Pamatrada design. This was a wonderful engine, most reliable, wonderfully comfortable for passengers, and of even greater importance, showed a full 25% fuel economy. And those are the engines which are actually fitted to our vessel Manxman, and really they're a joy for anybody to see. Then, of course, the next development had to be the diesel. The diesels prior to that had all been low-speed diesels, and the engines were far too high to make them suitable for car ferries where you had to have the big open deck. But then they invented the medium-speed diesel, which, of course, was much lower and was suitable, and that really has taken over the market.
You've lived through these two World War situations with all the boats. The steam packet vessels, I think then, in both wars, indeed, got drafted in for war service, did they not?
Oh yes, the Lords of the Admiralty called the ships up. In fact, in many cases, even several days before war was declared, when it was obviously imminent. And regrettably, in both World Wars, we lost 4 ships in each.
You wouldn't have needed them anyway, though, presumably, for...
Oh no, there was nothing we could do because tourism just folded up here.
Yeah, that's right. Were there any particular deeds of daring that are recorded by the ships?
Well, I found that seamen are a very modest race and these stories don't get told. I do know, for instance, that at D-Day, the Lady of Man and the Ben Macree were both the headquarters ships for assault flotillas of American commandos. The Old Victoria was at the Arromanches beachhead, which saw one of the most severe or most intense fighting. But also, that brings you to Dunkirk, which was, of course, preceded it, and the ships were all very much involved there. I think the mere fact that one OBE, several DSCs and a couple of DSMs were awarded to crews of the vessels is proof positive that there were deeds of daring.
Yes.
And one interesting little statistic there, which Connery Chappell extracted, was that of all the men who were rescued from the Dunkirk beaches, 1 in 14 travelled on an Isle of Man Steam Packet Company vessel.
Sidney Shimon was only the 11th general manager in the Steam Packet Company's 150 years, and when he recorded this programme, he told me that a year or two before he joined the company, they'd also ventured into air travel.
It was in 1935 that the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company and Ollie Airlines got together and put up the finance to start Isle of Man air services. Subsequently, Ollie backed out, and the Steam Packet and the LMS continued to run the services. And these, in fact, continued up to the end of 1947. They didn't make any profits, they made losses every year, but the traffic was gradually increasing. Then in January 1948, the socialist government in power in England brought in the Air Nationalisation Act, and the nationalised company made it abundantly clear that they weren't going to tolerate a small operator and they'd run us off the air, or whatever you might call it.
Yeah.
So they made an offer to buy us out. It meant that we got our original investment and a small interest back, so this is how we ceased being in air services.
And the packet company weren't all that bothered about it, really, were they, in the end?
Well, we could see a future in it, and therefore, you know, we wanted to be in it, and I'm sure we were glad we were in it, and we were sorry that we had to get out when we did.
Yeah. Well, when you started with the company, I think you told us there were 16 ships in service. How many vessels in regular use now?
Well, now we have a total of 8. 4 car ferries, 2 passenger-only vessels, and 2 cargo vessels. 4 of these can be termed as all-year-round ships. Another one can be termed as a winter relief, and the 3 others are retained purely and simply to cater for the summer peaks.
You're listening to 50 Years Serving the Island, a series of programmes featuring highlights from Manx Radio's archives during the station's first 5 decades serving the public in the Isle of Man. Today, we bring you an edition of Time to Remember with David Callister, first broadcast in 2005, marking the 175th anniversary of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company.
25 years ago, during the holiday season, the Douglas operation employed over 600 people, and crews would be expected to work between 70 and 80 hours a week. Tourism was still attracting respectable numbers, but the decline was setting in. After a bumper year in 1979 for the Millennium of Tynwald, 1980 saw a steep drop in day trippers and a disappointing reduction in long-term travellers. Another recession had arrived, and grumbles about the cost of sea travel were beginning to emerge. So I asked Sid Shimon about the fare structure of 1980 and how it compared with about 20 years earlier.
Say 2 adults and 2 children bring their car along to have a holiday in the Isle of Man. It's going to cost them something round about the £100 mark. Isn't this a bit too expensive, say, compared with continental and European travel?
No, I don't agree expensive compared with these others. It's always been our proud boast that, in fact, the fares and the car freights charged by the Steam Packet Company are amongst the lowest charged by any shipping operator in the British Isles, and anyone can compare these. I can give you just some examples. The one you've taken, if that self-same family decided to travel from Dover to Calais to go to the continent, it would cost them £123. If they decided to go to the Channel Islands, £130. If they decided to go to Ireland from Holyhead to Dunleary, it would cost them £132. So in that context, our £100 looks very reasonable.
So you're quite happy with that then? Well, but what about package tours, though?
Well, I don't think we're really there. We would be comparing like with like. There are some excellent package tours to the Isle of Man, and at very reasonable terms.
I wonder how the figures compare with, say, let's go back 20 years. Let's go back to 1960. What would the single, or rather, let's take the return fare. What would the return fare have been on the Steam Packet then?
Well, the return fare in 1960 was just under £3, and it is now £22. So it's increased about 7.5 times. As regards your question as does it compare favourably, I would say it does. Just a few examples. Fortuitously, you picked 1960, which was the year we signed the contract for our first car ferry Manx Maid, and she cost £1 million. A repeat order of her today certainly would be in excess of £10 million.
Really?
That's 10 times as much. Taking the wages of a craftsman or a seaman back in 1960, somewhere between £9 and £10 a week. Nowadays, 8 or 9 times that. Fuel, an even greater example. In 1960, our fuel bill was £160,000. In 1980, it will be £1.75 million. That's 11 times as much.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
finally, port charges. In 1960, we paid for all the import charges, as all the ports to which we sail, a total of £60,000. In 1980, we will pay to the Isle of Man Harbour Board alone practically £500,000.
Really? Yeah.
So I would say those do show up that the fares compare very favourably.
Well, yes, if we look at that sort of wage scale from £9 or £10 a week to whatever it may be in the sort of 80 region now, the fare 20 years ago, in fact, was about a third of a working man's wage, whereas now it's only about a quarter.
Yes, that's just about right.
By the 1970s, the Steam Packet Company were being criticised for not introducing a ro-ro service. The Harbour Board chairman, Roy MacDonald, had been pressing them for a long time to update. Competition had also arrived in the form of Manx Line.
Well, the first thing I would say, what exactly is meant by ro-ro? Ro-ro is purely an abbreviation for roll on, roll off.
Yeah.
And last Saturday, for instance, almost 900 motor cars rolled on or rolled off our vessels.
Yes.
So we've got 4 ro-ro vessels which cater for tourism. What we don't have is ro-ro for cargo. And I know the critics have said that we have been slow in moving, but in fact I have to say they do not face the facts. When we appeared before Tynwald in 1977 and asked Tynwald not to support another operator by spending £650,000 of the taxpayers' money, we were naturally asked some leading questions by members of Tynwald as to when we would move into ro-ro. And we gave them the only answer we could, which was when we can afford it. For at that time, and this is no secret because this is published in the company's accounts, we had less than £130,000 in the bank, and we owed £3.5 million for building the Mona's Queen and the Lady of Man. Our best estimate was that given reasonable trading, by the early 1980s, we would be in a position to go forward. Now, at the end of 1979, we had £1.5 million in the bank, which roughly equates the amount we still owed on the 2 latest calf ferries. So now we are in a position where we can consider to go forward. But I would stress that the decision that's to be taken is a momentous one. It must be correct, because otherwise it can have an effect on the company, on the island in general, and on tourism in particular.
The late Sid Shimon, talking in 1980, and who as director and general manager of the Steam Packet Company was there to take the company through the stormy passage to the Steam Packet merger. The blackest chapter in the history of the Steam Packet Company occurred on the 3rd of December in 1909.
Ocean line is sheltered from the storm. Helen Vannin on the waves was born. Her hold was full and battened down as she sailed towards far Liverpool town. Oh, Ellen Vannin of the Isle of Man Company. Oh, Ellen Vannin, lost in the Irish Sea, with a crew of 21 Manx men, her passengers Liverpool businessmen. Farewell to Mona's Isle, farewell. This little ship was bound for hell. Oh, Ellen Vannin of the Isle of Man Company. Oh, Ellen Vannin, lost in the Irish Sea.
The story of the loss of the Ellen Vannin has been told and retold. The steamship set sail from Ramsey on the regular journey to Liverpool with cargo and passengers. The sailing was dogged by deteriorating weather and the wind reached storm force 11. The vessel made it to the Mersey, but for reasons that were never firmly established, foundered and broke up with the loss of her 14 passengers and 21 crew.
Stand a mile from the bar light ship by a mighty wave. Ellen Vannin was hit. She sank in the waters of Liverpool Bay. There she lies to this day. Oh, Ellen Fanning of the Isle of Man Company. Oh, Ellen Fanning, lost in the Irish Sea. Few Manx men now remember the third day of the month December, a terrible storm in 1909. Ellen Fanning sailed for the very last time. Oh, Ellen Fanning of the Isle of Man Company. Oh, Ellen Fanning, lost in the Irish Sea.
This song, The Ellen Vannin Tragedy, was written by Liverpudlian Hugh Jones, a member of the Liverpool Spinners folk group. On one of the group's many visits to the island, Hugh recalled how he came to write the song back in the 1960s.
Well, I have a great interest in ships and sailing ships, really. And I get a lot of little books and things, and I was given a book from the IOM Steam Packet Company, which is a little sort of handout book that they give, and a brief history of some of their ships. In fact, there was a man called John Caneen who used to live on the island, gave it to me, and he said, there's a good ship in here. One of the ships was a gun runner during the American War of well, the Civil War, and he said, it might be a song in that, and I read all about it, but there was this little ship called the Ellen Vannin, and that was sort of struck me as more romantic, because about that time, I think it was 1911, the Titanic went down. Well, 2 years before that, the Ellen Vannin went down. By the time people had started thinking about this tragedy, because it was quite a serious thing, everybody was writing songs about the Titanic, so I thought, good idea, but make one about little Ellen Vannin.
Hugh Jones talking in somewhere in the 1970s. When Charles Gard compiled his Manx Radio documentary on the loss of the Ellen Vannin, he found two people who were able to recall the day that she set sail on that last tragic voyage. The late Tommy Barry was a riveter with the company.
That afternoon was a sunny afternoon like this. Not a breath, because we stood at the point of tongue watching her going down. No, it was quite a surprise, you know, when I heard about it. She was a well-made ship, you know. Oh yes, seaworthy. Well, that's what I'm saying. To the Board of Trade, had just been over surveillance. You see, they had to have a ticket every year to sail, make it seaworthy. That was sad. You know, knowing all these chaps, and when they'd go down every other day, when she'd be coming in, you know, they'd have a chat with her, you know.
The Manx writer and musicologist Mona Douglas described how she had a premonition about the disaster and urged her father, who was due to sail on the doomed vessel, not to go.
Father should have been on board. He was going back to business by the night sailing. And we were living at Balaric at that time, and I very often used to go out in the afternoons, and that particular afternoon I'd gone, it was a very stormy day, but not raining, and I'd gone for a walk over what we call the Dream. That's the open part that looks right out over the sea before you turn round to go down to the dune. And when I was coming back from the dune, I looked out over the sea, and I got an awful feeling of terror, really. I was scared stiff or something, and I looked out over the sea, and there was something like a great big ball of fire, seeming, I didn't know what it was. So I hurried up, was trying to get home away from it, and then it seemed to sort of explode, and in the middle of it I saw something like a ship. And I had this feeling that it was something very bad. And I ran home, and I was really hysterical. I was screaming and carrying on, and really made me ill. I couldn't eat or do anything. And I was telling Father, he mustn't go tonight, he mustn't go tonight. The ship was going to go on fire. And he didn't believe it, of course, but in the end he said, oh, well, if it'll make you feel better, I won't go tonight, I'll go in the morning from Douglas. And that's what he did. And of course, I don't know whether he knew before he went on board at Douglas, but we heard when the postman came up that morning from Douglas, they got the word, they telephoned through to say the Ellen Vannon had gone down with all hands lost.
That documentary programme also revealed that Mona Douglas had been born aboard the Ellen Vannon on the 18th of September 1898.
I wasn't expected just at that time, and Mother was crossing from Ramsey to Liverpool on the Ellen Vannon, and she got very, very seasick, and apparently this brought on the birth, and I was born before they got to Liverpool.
The late Mona Douglas, who went on to become one of the most important figures in Manx culture in the 20th century.
Snaefell, Tynwald, Ben Macree, 14 ships have sailed the sea, proudly bearing a Manx name. But there's one will never again.
When a Board of Trade inquiry into the loss of the Ellen Vannon was held, they concluded that the heavy seas probably caused the disaster and discounted stories that she'd been in collision with another vessel. The inquiry found no fault with the ship and laid no blame on the company, the master or the crew. 18 bodies of the 35 who were aboard were found washed up in the days following the disaster. The others were never found. The wreck was blown up to remove it as a hazard to navigation. A disaster fund raised in excess of £13,000 for distribution to the dependents. The last of these beneficiaries died in 1983.
Oh, Ellen Vannon of the Isle of Man Company. Oh, Ellen Vannon, lost in the Irish Sea.
The sound of your life. Manx Radio.
You've been listening to this week's edition of 50 Years Serving the Island, where we heard an edition of Time to Remember with David Callister, which was first broadcast as part of a special series in 2005, marking the 175th anniversary of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company. And you'll shortly be able to hear this programme again, along with lots more exclusive content from Manx Radio's archives, by going to manxradio.com/portal.